This is a barrel of Kazakh crude oil, Tengiz blend, light and sweet, extracted from fields beneath the Caspian steppe. Worth $82 on international markets, represents 43% of Kazakhstan's GDP, 67% of export revenue, and the entire foundation of Central Asian economic stability. This barrel cannot reach global markets without Russia's permission. 3 days ago, Russia stopped giving permission. On January 23, 2026, at 3 a.m. Moscow time, Transneft, Russia's state pipeline monopoly, announced emergency maintenance on the Caspian Pipeline Consortium system, the 1,500-kilometer pipeline that carries Kazakh oil from the Tengiz fields to the Russian Black Sea port of Novorossiysk. The maintenance has no completion date. The pipeline flow, 1.5 million barrels daily, has stopped entirely. Kazakhstan's primary export route is closed. This is not maintenance. This is economic strangulation. Russia is demonstrating what happens to former Soviet republics that drift too far from Moscow's orbit, and Kazakhstan, the largest economy in Central Asia, the anchor of regional stability, America's quiet partner in counterterrorism operations, has approximately 45 days before its economy collapses. Here's what they're not telling you. The CPC pipeline maintenance follows 18 months of escalating Russian pressure on Kazakhstan's geopolitical positioning. In March 2024, Kazakhstan abstained on UN votes condemning Russian actions in Ukraine, angering Moscow, which expected support, not abstention. In August 2024, President Tokayev met with Ukrainian President Zelensky in Ankara, becoming the first Central Asian leader to engage directly with Ukrainian leadership since the invasion. In November 2024, Kazakhstan signed a strategic partnership agreement with the European Union that included provisions for increased energy exports to Europe, potentially bypassing Russia. In December 2025, Kazakhstan announced negotiations with Azerbaijan and Georgia on a trans-Caspian pipeline that would carry Kazakh oil westward without touching Russian territory. Each step represented Kazakhstan's careful effort to reduce dependence on Russia, hedging against the isolation that pipeline dependency creates. Each step angered Moscow. The maintenance announcement came 3 days after Kazakhstan's energy minister publicly confirmed that trans-Caspian pipeline negotiations had reached advanced stages. The timing is not coincidental. At 9:30 a.m. Astana time on January 23rd, I spoke with a senior advisor to Kazakhstan's president, who has been involved in energy negotiations for 15 years. The advisor agreed to speak anonymously, voice tight with controlled anger. We knew this risk existed. We have been diversifying for years, but diversification takes time. The Trans-Caspian pipeline is 5 years from completion. Russia is punishing us today for plans that won't materialize until 2031. I asked about alternative export routes. There are no alternatives at this volume. We can ship small quantities by rail to China. We can ship small quantities by barge across the Caspian to Azerbaijan. But the CPC pipeline carries 1.5 million barrels daily. Our alternatives might handle 200,000 barrels. The gap is 1.3 million barrels that have nowhere to go. I asked about the economic impact. Oil revenue funds 40% of our national budget. Without exports, the budget collapses within 60 days. The tenge will crash. Inflation will spike. Unemployment will surge. We are a country of 20 million people facing economic devastation because one man in Moscow decided to teach us a lesson. The mechanism of Russian control is geographic and absolute. Kazakhstan is landlocked. Its oil, 2.1 million barrels produced daily, must cross foreign territory to reach global markets. Geography made that territory Russian. The CPC pipeline was built in the 1990s, when Kazakhstan was newly independent and Russia was too weak to fully exploit the leverage. The pipeline operates as a consortium. Kazakhstan owns 19%, Russia owns 31%, and international oil companies own the rest. But the pipeline physically crosses Russian territory. Transneft operates the Russian segment. Russia controls the loading terminal at Novorossiysk. On paper, the consortium structure protects Kazakhstan. In practice, Russian operational control means Russian veto power. The pipeline flows when Russia permits. It stops when Russia doesn't. Alternative routes were always theoretically possible. The Trans-Caspian pipeline, under the Caspian Sea to Azerbaijan, then through Georgia to Turkey, would bypass Russia entirely. But the Caspian's legal status was disputed for decades, blocking underwater pipelines. And the route requires crossing 4 countries, each with their own interests and vulnerabilities. The Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline already carries Azerbaijani oil through this corridor. Connecting Kazakh fields to that system is technically feasible, but requires 5 years of construction, and Kazakhstan doesn't have 5 years. Kazakhstan has 45 days. At 11 a.m. Moscow time on January 23rd, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov addressed the pipeline closure in his daily briefing. Technical issues require temporary suspension of CPC operations. Russia remains committed to partnership with Kazakhstan and to the reliable functioning of energy infrastructure. We expect maintenance to complete expeditiously once technical requirements are satisfied. Reporters asked what technical requirements meant. Technical specifications are matters for operational personnel. Political matters are separate from technical matters. The answer confirmed what everyone already understood. Technical requirements means political compliance. The maintenance ends when Kazakhstan demonstrates sufficient alignment with Russian interests. This is where the lie becomes unsustainable. The international community treats pipeline infrastructure as commercial, subject to contracts, arbitration, and economic logic. The assumption underlies energy security frameworks throughout Europe and Asia. Russia treats pipeline infrastructure as strategic, subject to political direction, exempt from commercial constraints, available as leverage whenever Moscow decides leverage is needed. The gap between these treatments is the vulnerability Kazakhstan now faces. The CPC consortium has contracts, governance structures, and dispute resolution mechanisms. None of them matter when Transneft simply announces maintenance and stops pumping. Kazakhstan could sue. The arbitration process takes years. The economy collapses in weeks. Kazakhstan could appeal to consortium partners, Chevron, ExxonMobil, Shell, who collectively own 50% of the pipeline and are losing $120 million daily in foregone shipments. The partners have no enforcement mechanism. They can protest. They cannot compel. Kazakhstan could appeal to the international community. The international community has condemned Russian energy coercion before. Condemnation doesn't move oil through pipelines. The lesson is stark. Infrastructure that crosses adversary territory is infrastructure that adversaries control, regardless of ownership structures or legal frameworks. Less than 45 days separate today from Kazakhstan's fiscal crisis. The timeline is determined by budget arithmetic and reserve levels. Kazakhstan's national budget requires approximately $35 billion annually in oil revenue. The budget is designed for $95 to $100 per barrel oil and 1.8 million barrels daily in exports. Current prices, $82, and current exports, essentially zero through CPC, create a revenue gap of approximately $2.3 billion monthly. The National Fund of Kazakhstan, the sovereign wealth fund that stores oil windfall revenue, holds approximately $58 billion. The fund could theoretically cover the revenue gap for extended periods, but the fund's assets are not fully liquid. Approximately $34 billion is invested in long-term securities that cannot be immediately liquidated without significant losses. Liquid reserves total approximately $24 billion. At $2.3 billion monthly deficit, liquid reserves cover approximately 10 months. But the calculation ignores second-order effects that accelerate the timeline. Currency pressure. The tenge is already falling, down 14% since the pipeline closure announcement. Currency collapse increases import costs, fueling inflation. Capital flight. Kazakh businesses and citizens are converting tenge to dollars, draining banking system liquidity. The National Bank of Kazakhstan is burning reserves to defend the currency, approximately $800 million since January 23rd. Credit market closure. Kazakhstan's government and corporate borrowers depend on international credit markets. Sovereign spreads have widened 340 basis points since the announcement. New borrowing is effectively unavailable. The combined pressures compress the timeline from 10 months to approximately 45 days. By early March, Kazakhstan faces a choice between depleting the national fund entirely or allowing sovereign default. At 2 p.m. Astana time on January 24th, Kazakhstan's government announced emergency economic measures including temporary capital controls limiting dollar purchases, suspension of non-essential government spending, emergency negotiations with China for currency swap arrangements, activation of strategic reserve provisions with unspecified Asian partners. The measures are tourniquet on a severed artery. They slow bleeding. They don't stop it. When Kazakhstan collapses, the regional cascade begins. Central Asia's economies are integrated through trade, migration, and remittance flows that all connect to Kazakhstan. Uzbekistan. 1.8 million Uzbek citizens work in Kazakhstan, sending approximately $4 billion annually in remittances, equal to 5% of Uzbek GDP. Kazakh economic collapse means job losses for Uzbek migrants and remittance collapse for Uzbek families. Kyrgyzstan. 700,000 Kyrgyz work in Kazakhstan, with remittances representing 8% of Kyrgyz GDP. Additionally, 40% of Kyrgyz imports come from Kazakhstan. Supply chain disruption and remittance collapse hit simultaneously. Tajikistan. Though more oriented toward Russia, Tajikistan depends on Kazakh grain imports and transit routes. Food security and trade flows degrade together. Turkmenistan. The most isolated Central Asian state, but Turkmenistan's natural gas exports to China transit Kazakhstan. Pipeline disruption could extend to Turkmen flows, compounding regional crisis. The total population affected, approximately 75 million people across Central Asia, most already living at subsistence levels, facing economic disruption that their governments cannot absorb. At 4:30 p.m. Moscow time on January 24th, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov gave an interview to state television, addressing concerns about Central Asian stability. Russia has always been and will remain Central Asia's most reliable partner. Temporary technical issues should not be interpreted as geopolitical pressure. We encourage our Kazakh friends to engage constructively on matters of mutual concern, and we are confident that technical issues will be resolved through technical cooperation. The interview's subtext was clear. Kazakhstan's submission is the technical requirement for pipeline restoration. The maintenance ends when Astana demonstrates satisfactory alignment with Moscow. The required alignment likely includes withdrawal from Trans-Caspian pipeline negotiations, termination of the EU strategic partnership, public statements supporting Russian positions on Ukraine, enhanced military cooperation through CSTO frameworks, personnel changes removing officials Moscow considers hostile. The requirements are speculative. Russia hasn't stated them explicitly. The ambiguity is intentional. Kazakhstan must guess what submission requires and offer enough to satisfy. The guessing reinforces subordination. What the informed understand is that Russia's Kazakhstan strategy previews Russia's approach to all post-Soviet states that have attempted neutrality or Western orientation. Armenia learned in 2023 when Azerbaijan, with Russian acquiescence, seized Nagorno-Karabakh despite Russian peacekeeping forces. Armenia's flirtation with Western security partnerships was punished by Russian abandonment. Georgia learned in 2008 when Russian forces invaded after Georgia pursued NATO membership. Ukraine learned in 2014 and 2022. Kazakhstan is learning now. The lesson is consistent. Post-Soviet states exist within a Russian sphere of influence. Western partnerships, economic diversification, and political independence are tolerated only to the extent they don't threaten Russian interests. When they threaten Russian interests, Russia acts. Militarily if necessary, economically if sufficient. Pipeline control is the perfect coercive instrument. It causes no casualties, generates no dramatic imagery, and can be framed as technical rather than political. The suffering is distributed across millions of people gradually, rather than concentrated in ways that generate international outrage. The coercion is effective because alternatives require years to develop, years that Russia can use to punish, extract concessions, and demonstrate the costs of defection. At 7 p.m. Astana time on January 24th, President Tokayev addressed the nation. His speech was remarkable for what it didn't say. Kazakhstan faces temporary disruption to export infrastructure. We are engaging with all relevant partners to resolve technical issues as rapidly as possible. The government has implemented measures to protect economic stability during this transition. Our strategic direction remains unchanged. Kazakhstan seeks partnership with all nations based on mutual respect and mutual benefit. The speech didn't mention Russia by name. It didn't characterize the technical issues as coercion. It didn't announce concessions to Russian demands. The restraint suggested Tokayev was still negotiating, still hoping to preserve some independence while satisfying enough Russian demands to restore pipeline flow. The outcome of that negotiation will determine Kazakhstan's future orientation. At 9 p.m. Eastern on January 24th, the U.S. State Department issued a statement expressing concern about disruptions to energy infrastructure and encouraging all parties to ensure reliable energy supplies consistent with contractual obligations. The statement's blandness reflected American impotence. The United States has no leverage over Russian pipeline operations. American companies, Chevron, ExxonMobil, are consortium partners losing billions, and they have no enforcement mechanism either. The United States could impose sanctions on Transneft or Russian pipeline operations. But such sanctions would affect Russian energy exports to Europe and Asia, markets that Washington has encouraged as alternatives to Russian gas. The tools are either ineffective or counterproductive. The barrel of Kazakh crude sits in storage tanks at Tengiz, waiting for a pipeline that isn't flowing. The oil will degrade over time. Light crude oxidizes, loses value, eventually becomes unsaleable. But degradation takes months. The economic damage is measured in days. Each day of closure costs Kazakhstan approximately $125 million in foregone export revenue. Each day depletes reserves, weakens the currency, erodes business confidence. Each day demonstrates that Kazakhstan's independence was always contingent on Russian tolerance. The demonstration is the point. Russia isn't seeking permanent economic collapse in Kazakhstan. A failed state on their border serves no Russian interest. Russia is seeking submission. The pipeline reopens when submission is complete. The precedent affects every landlocked nation dependent on infrastructure crossing adversary territory. Mongolia, dependent on Russian and Chinese rail. Nepal, dependent on Indian and Chinese roads. Armenia, dependent on Georgian and Iranian routes. Geography constrains sovereignty. Infrastructure multiplies constraints. Nations that cannot move goods without neighbors' permission cannot act without neighbors' approval. Kazakhstan spent 30 years believing that commercial relationships transcended political relationships, that pipeline contracts created mutual dependencies, restraining Russian coercion. The belief was always fiction. Russia doesn't understand mutual dependency. Russia understands hierarchy. The pipeline was never partnership, it was leash. The leash is now being yanked. $82 per barrel, sitting in tanks. 1.5 million barrels daily, not flowing. 45 days until fiscal crisis. 75 million Central Asians watching what happens when Russia decides to teach a lesson. The barrel of oil is just hydrocarbons, ancient sunlight converted to chemical energy, valuable only if it reaches someone who will burn it. The pipeline that carries that barrel is just steel pipe, 1,500 kilometers of tube connecting wellhead to port, valuable only if product flows through. Russia controls the tube. Kazakhstan has the oil. The value belongs to whoever controls the flow. Russia controls the flow. Kazakhstan is learning what that means. The rest of Central Asia will learn soon enough. The barrel waits. The pipeline is silent. The lesson is being taught. 45 days.